What would you do about our school systems?
They are so awful. The public has no idea. I'm reading a book about the schools, and the woman who's writing it, Diane Ravitch, is talking about how teachers have due process before they can be fired. Now, when you look into the facts of it, right down here in, I think it was Atherton, it cost $500,000 to fire one incompetent teacher. You don't have a big enough budget, And
right.
in New York, you have something called the rubber room. These are teachers who are so incompetent that the principals don't want them in the classroom, and they get paid full salary, and they show up, and they accrue pension rights, and so forth. And the last time, I forget how many millions of dollars are spent a year in New York paying for teachers who don't teach, and in fact don't do anything but show up at the same time as if they were teaching, and they read magazines or whatever they feel like doing. And this farce goes on.
All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. I am really excited to have you guys here today for this one. I'm going to get a little personal today. So we've talked about it on the show before, but I am indeed a public school teacher, and I know that a lot of libertarians out there are suspicious of public school teachers, and rightly so. And to be fair, I think a lot of Christians are suspicious of public school teachers, and again, I think that is rightly so. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about my background, like how I became a public school teacher. And then I want to talk about tenure, because this is my fourth year teaching for the same school here in Kentucky. And after 4 years, you are eligible for teacher tenure. And then at the beginning of your fifth year, you will receive that. And of course, tenure basically makes it impossible for your district to fire you, or at least the circumstances have to be perfect in order for them to do that. So I want to talk about how I became a teacher, and then I want to talk about why I think tenure is a problem. And this is the big reveal on the show today. I do not plan to accept it for both libertarian and Christian reasons. So I want to discuss all of those things on the show. So if you're interested in this stuff and you've been wondering how I got to the position that I'm in today professionally, this is going to be the show for you. So a lot of you guys know that I went to college. We talked about this, I think, on episode 10 when I interviewed Dr. Matt Barber. But I went to college initially to become a youth minister. That was my goal. And so I started at Cincinnati Christian University, which does not exist anymore, in 2007. And my degree program was actually in youth ministry. And then I realized about like 5 weeks into that program that was a worthless degree, and I didn't want to do it anyways. And so I wound up getting a degree in biblical studies, which was a much more productive use of my time there. And I still went into ministry when I was finished. In fact, I got my first job in ministry at my home church when I was 19 years old. It was a paid position. And I was a bivocational student minister for like 8 years. So I worked at Hebron Lutheran Church in Hebron, Kentucky for 5 years, and then what was Christ United Methodist Church for 3 years after that, and ran programs, and they were very successful, and I really enjoyed my time in ministry. But as time went on, and especially when I was at Christ United Methodist Church, I realized that ministry was not going to be a long-term solution for me. And one of these days, I'm gonna tell you guys the entire story about what happened at CUMC and all of that stuff, because it is a really interesting story and completely burned me out on ministry and on wanting to be involved in ministry in any way. And so it's really important that story is told, but today is not the day for that. But basically, when I was in ministry, I realized that I really enjoyed the teaching aspect of ministry. Like, I loved being able to break down the Bible, and I loved teaching lessons. And I would teach at our program on Sunday nights, and I guess Wednesday nights at CUMC, Sunday nights at Hebron Lutheran Church, and I would teach at Sunday school on Sunday mornings. And so I had all these opportunities to teach that were really, really good. Like, I had a great time doing that, and I really enjoyed it. And I also really liked the relational aspect of being in youth ministry. Like, I love building relationships with kids and hanging out with them, and just kind of helping them to see life from a different perspective. Like, it's really, really satisfying to do that. And so, around 2015, I kind of realized that ministry wasn't really going to be for me a long-term option. And I've been doing it for a really long time at that point, bivocational, trying to pay my dues, struggling it out. And it just seemed like it was really hard to make it. And even if I did make it in ministry, it was just going to be a lot of frustration and politics, which is something that many people don't know know about being in ministry. You go into ministry because you want to tell people about Jesus, but in reality, you spend about 90% of your time doing bureaucratic and administrative sort of activities. And then if you work like I did for a major denomination like the United Methodist Church, you're just a number to them. And it's really difficult to make a serious impact when you're constantly trying to deal with the large bureaucracy that comes with being involved with a denomination. And I did not want to spend the rest of my life doing something like that. So I decided that ministry probably was not going to be for me. And but I thought about the skills that I'd had. I had my degree in biblical studies, which is a degree in basically first century history, Greco-Roman and Jewish history, with a little bit of philosophy and theology thrown in on the side. And I've always been very interested in history, and I've always read a lot. And so it was kind of natural for me to want to find a career path where I could go and use those skills in the classroom. And I also thought about how I had developed all of these skills working with teenagers, and so teaching just seemed like kind of a natural segue for me. And in 2015, this was before I had really started thinking about politics deeply. If you've listened to I think episode 4 where I talk about my libertarian background, I have always just kind of had the impression that if Jesus is king, then no one else should have that power. And so if I could go back in time and identify myself politically, then I would have still considered myself a libertarian, but I didn't think about it philosophically in any deep sort of way there, other than I didn't really have trust for the government. But when I decided to become a teacher, I didn't think about the consequences of working for a government school. I just went for it. So at this 2015, I signed up for a program at the college that's right down the road from my house, Northern Kentucky University. And in the fall of 2016, I started my prerequisite courses to go and get my master's degree in education. And so I did that for a year. And at the end of 2016, I stepped down from ministry at my church, and I was just working basically my day job at that point. So all through 2017, I was working on my prerequisites for school and just kind of working my job. Well, when it came to the end of 2017, I was going to be, I guess the fall semester of 2017, that was when I was going to officially start my Master's of Art in Teaching program. And so in order to be a part of that program, you have to take a couple of tests in the state of Kentucky that make you a quote-unquote highly qualified teacher in order to, like I said, be a part of that MAT program. So I'd taken all of these tests, and I'd done really well on them. And I remember I was hanging out with my parents one night, and I was like, it'd be really nice if I could get a job this fall while I was in school, because, again, I was working at a dry cleaner at that time, and I wanted to be able to make more money than I was currently making, and I could do that if I got a job in teaching, but I didn't have any experience. But because I was in this program, I was technically eligible from the state's perspective to be emergency certified to teach. And so I was talking to my parents about this one night, and my dad said that I should just go for it, that there was no shame in at least putting my resume out there and seeing if there was anyone that would hire me. And I figured that even though I didn't have any formal experience teaching in a classroom, that I had a lot of experience in youth ministry, and that might translate really well to the classroom. So I didn't have any experience at all as a teacher, and I threw out my resume to a bunch of different schools and did not hear much back from them. And then somebody in the MAT program at NKU contacted me and said that there was a local inner city school. It's about 12 miles down the road from where I live, and it's an urban school. And she said that they desperately needed teachers down there, that they couldn't find enough teachers to fill all of the positions that they had, and that if I submitted my resume, that she would send an email to the principal and basically have her look at it. And so I did, because I really wanted to get a job. And so I sent my resume in, and I had an interview, and they wound up hiring me. And I was hired, again, without any formal experience. Not only had I never been in a classroom before, hadn't done any observations or anything like that, I had never even been in an education program at the higher education level. Like, I had never taken a college course on education, because at this point, I had done prerequisites like history classes and things like that to join the MAT program, the Masters of Arts in Teaching program, but I had not actually taken any of those Masters of Arts in teaching classes. Though I was thrown into a classroom in an inner city school with zero experience. I was emergency certified by the state because I met the minimum qualifications to be a teacher, and I had absolutely, like I said, no experience whatsoever. And so you can only imagine that, like, being in an inner city school with no experience in the classroom, my first year was an absolute disaster. And I was really, really fortunate enough to have a great partner down there and to have a lot of great teachers that I looked up to. And even as I was in my MAT program during this time, like, I didn't really learn that much by going to college and getting my degree in education. And in fact, I think like literally anybody could join the MAT program and walk away with a degree in teaching. Like, it was not that hard. I learned a lot from being down and working at this inner city school. And one of the things that I realized immediately was just how messed up the public school system was. So I graduated high school in 2007, and it was a lot different back then. Like, I know that the schools have always had problems and things like that, but when I went to school, you know, kids were just, the expectation was just that you were going to do your work, and like you had to, even if you didn't like your teacher, you had to at least close your mouth and listen to them. But it's not like that anymore, and especially in inner city schools, there are all kinds of behavior problems, which makes sense because a lot of these kids grow up on the streets without any sort of parents, and their lives are just very crazy and dysfunctional. But one of the things that I noticed immediately is that it was very, very difficult for us as I was working at this inner city school to discipline kids. Like, if a kid cussed you out or threw something at you or got into a fight, you might be able to put them in detention for a day, or they might get pulled out of your classroom for one period, or, you know, if we were really lucky, a kid might get suspended. But it was very, very difficult to punish these kids. Now, I always wondered, why was this the case? Like, why did it seem so difficult to control a classroom and discipline kids that were obviously, like, not only being disrespectful to teachers, but putting the teachers and the other kids, more importantly, the other kids, at risk by their violent behavior, and I couldn't figure it out. And so I started asking questions and kind of thinking about it. And at this time, this school was under a federal Department of Education review. It was one of those Obama era reviews where they had determined that the school that I was working at unfairly punished black boys at a much higher rate than other students in our school. And so we were under review from the federal Department of Education, and then also the state did not like the test scores that we were putting out at our school, which obviously you have kids that are never read to and that are coming into 7th grade reading at a 1st grade level. Like, we're not going to do well on the state standardized test. Not that the people that work for the Kentucky Department of Education understand any of those things. I don't think that they care or know about that at all. But they had all of these expectations for us to increase these test scores with kids that just didn't have the skills to be successful on the test because of the way in which they were raised. And one of the most infuriating things about this time down there to me was that we had an alternative school program down there, a really good one. Like, the district did everything they could. I'm not blaming this on the district at all. I think that a lot of the problems, as we're going to talk about today and then in later episodes, actually come from higher and higher levels of government bureaucracy. I feel like a lot of the local school districts, especially this one, are actually really supportive of their teachers and really supportive of their students. They're just at the bottom of a large bureaucracy and can't do much to move it mechanically. But we had this alternative school program where we would take these kids that were just out of control in the classroom and really violent and things like that, and they would go to this alternative school. And the crazy thing about it is that, like, you know, these kids, when they went to the alternative school, they would get one-on-one instruction. It was a very structured environment, and they didn't have the distraction of other students being around there. So it was kind of like a win-win, because these kids that were at risk got the educational services that they needed there in a more structured environment, and the kids that did want to learn in the general education environment were able to come in and learn in an environment that was a lot more calmed and controlled, because those kids were not able, or because those kids were in the alternative school and they weren't disrupting instruction and things like that. So it was great. And when you looked at the data from it, like, these kids would go to alternative school, and these would be kids that would have like 30% in all their class, 35% in all their class, and then all of a sudden they'd have A's and B's, and they wouldn't have any behavior problems because they were taken out of an environment where they had the temptation to act backed up. But the problem is, because of the way that the regulations are structured in our state, we can only keep them there for like 6 weeks. So these kids would go to alternative school. They do an amazing job. They'd really turn things around. And then we drop them right back off in the regular education classroom, and their grades would crash, and they would be a distraction and a safety risk to the other students in the classroom. So it was really frustrating. And it was also at this time, I think this was my, I can't remember if it was my first, I think it was the spring semester of my first year there, but that was when they had the teachers union strikes, because I guess the teachers wanted to get paid more, and in the state of Kentucky, our teacher pension system is just fundamentally broken. And so we had all of these school strikes. And I actually, because it was my first year and I didn't really know what was going on, I actually went down to the state capitol, and I wouldn't say that I necessarily participated in the strikes, but I was there with some of my coworkers, kind of just thinking about how all of this stuff worked. But then I realized, like, as all of these like teachers union strikes were going on, I realized, like, I'm not really sure if teachers need to be having a pension, because I don't know if it's a good deal for the taxpayer. And honestly, like, my thought on this whole thing was, I was looking at how much I was making as an emergency certified teacher, and I was like, if I'm not paying into the pension system, and if the school didn't give us all these benefits, and I actually be making a lot more money. And so I think a lot of these issues that they were thinking about, like a lot of these political issues, were actually causing a lot more problems in both professionally and then in the classroom. And so these experiences really got me thinking about all of these issues related to education and things like that. And this was one of the reasons, as I saw just how hypocritical and cynical a lot of the regulations and a lot of the politics, both coming out of the teachers unions and from the bureaucrats at the Kentucky Department of Education and at the federal Department of Education, were. Like, I realized just how hypocritical and how ineffective a lot of these policies were. Those were some of the factors that pushed me deeper and deeper into kind of libertarian philosophy as well. So I worked a second year at this inner city school, and the second year was a lot better than the first, because I had really good experience and actually really enjoyed my second year there. I had some really great kids, and even though it was a tough school to work at, like, I really did enjoy building relationships with those inner city kids. And in a lot of ways, like, they had experienced things that kids that go to other schools hadn't. And so you could have more, to a certain extent, you could have some more mature conversations with those kids. And so I really enjoyed it. But as we got towards the end of the school year, I took a look at the county school. So the inner city school that I was working at was an independent school district within the county that I work in. And there's like a city in the north, and there's like a kind of suburban area in between, and then it's very rural in the south. So the county school district, I was looking at their salary schedule, at the money that they pay the teachers, and I was realizing that it was going to be a lot more money to go and work for the county than it was to work in this inner city school district. And I realized too that I would be dealing with less behavior issues and maybe have more of an opportunity to be an effective teacher. And so, taking all those factors into consideration, I'd had a couple of years experience. I wound up applying for a job at one of the county schools, and I was able to get it. And the school that I work at is phenomenal. Like, we have an incredible administration, some of the best coworkers that I've ever had. They're the best coworkers that I've ever had. Like, I really love the school that I'm working at. And obviously it was a big change of pace from working in an inner city school. But a lot of the broken politics were still very prevalent in this school. And then, of course, I get hired there in the fall of 2019, and then by the spring of 2020, we're all sent home because of COVID. And it would take me an entire episode to talk about just how stupid and asinine the response to COVID was by the public education establishment. If you're listening to the show, you probably know just how dumb the response was from the public education people there. And I'm not going to go into detail on it because that would take us a little too far outside. But I realized with COVID just how corrupt and inept the federal Department of Education, the Kentucky Department of Education, the regulators, the teachers unions, the public education establishment. I realized just how corrupt those people were. And this made me more and more skeptical towards the system. And of course, this is the time that I started reading like Thomas Sowell, who we heard from in the introduction. And then ultimately I started reading Hayek and Rothbard and all of those. And then here I am being not quite an anarchist, but close to it, right? Because I'd realized just how broken these systems are. So I'm very, very skeptical towards a lot of these systems. But I still have this job as a public school teacher. And so I really have to think about the way that I present myself, both as a Christian, obviously, but then also as a libertarian in the school systems. And I'm deeply skeptical of it based on everything that's happened over the last 2.5 years, and then all of the experiences that I had in education before that. So teacher tenure is one of these ideas about which I am extremely skeptical. And tenure is a system, for those of you guys that don't know this, tenure is a system in which a teacher is granted a permanent post at their school. Once tenure is conferred, it is, as we heard in the clip from Thomas Sowell at the beginning, nearly impossible to fire an underperforming teacher. So there are a couple of ways to look at this, though, okay? So obviously, the good thing about teacher tenure is that as a public employee, it does protect you from capricious bosses, and it protects you from the public, which is the reason why most teachers, almost all teachers, decide to take tenure when it is given to them. And I can't explain enough, though, like, for those of you guys that don't understand how the education system works, like, there is a lot of bureaucratic control over the schools, and it is true that if there are bureaucrats, like at your local central office or at the state level, that don't like you, like, they're going to try to get rid of you, and they try to shuffle the deck, and they make a lot of political decisions about staffing and things like that at the bureaucratic level. And so tenure does protect good teachers from kind of capricious bureaucrats and things like that, right? And then it also protects teachers from the public, because one of the problems with being a public school teacher is that you are at the mercy of the parents. And while most of the parents, especially at the school that like I teach at right now, are very, very supportive of us, like, there are always going to be parents that are just going to be upset that their child doesn't get the treatment that they think that they deserve, or that just have a vendetta against the school and want to hurt somebody, they want to end somebody's career. And so it does give you an additional layer of protection from those kinds of people. But the benefits that are conferred by tenure can also be turned into a great detraction, because, again, as Thomas Sowell makes the point, Thomas Sowell has written a lot on education. It's really, really good stuff. But as Thomas Sowell said in the introduction, it also makes it really, really difficult to fire underperforming teachers. And sometimes teachers do interact with students in a way that is completely harmful, and those teachers need to be removed quickly. And teacher tenure makes it difficult for that to happen. So I want to say, before I get into this any further, because we're going to take a look at the way that tenure works in Kentucky, and then we're also going to take a look at an article that was written a couple years ago about how at the university level, people are moving away from tenure, even though at the public school level, they want to kind of re-enshrine this as a benefit that will never go away. And so we're going to deal with all of that in a minute. But I want to say at the start, right, like, I'm probably the only teacher in the state of Kentucky, maybe I'm the only teacher in the country, that has no desire whatsoever to receive tenure from their school. But I completely understand why my colleagues and why my coworkers want tenure. Like, it does offer them protection. And most of my coworkers are going to accept it because, again, at the end of the day, they have this job to support their family. Like, that's why they go to work. They do this job because they like it, but they're trying to make money, and they're trying to provide for their family. And so this incentive, this benefit of teacher tenure, gives people the opportunity to feel like they are protected in their job. So if you are a teacher that's listening to this, I do not hold it against you if you have received tenure. You're just following the incentives. And so for me, like, the problem is not taking an incentive that is provided for you. The problem is with the incentive itself. And so this kind of goes back to issues like student loan forgiveness or welfare or whatever. Like, I'm completely against student loan forgiveness. I'm completely against the welfare state. But if that incentive is being offered to you, it's very irrational for most people to turn down that incentive, right? And so this is one of the great critiques that libertarianism has about the way in which centrally planned economies ought to run, is that when a centrally planned economy makes decisions about labor, like providing public sector employees with tenure, or like forgiving student loans, they're just offering people incentives, right? And this is a basic law of economics. People accept, people follow, people take incentives when they are offered to them. So I want to say up front that, again, I'm not hating on anyone that has taken teacher tenure. I understand that the incentive exists and that for most people it is the rational path to take. So I have no problem with anyone accepting tenure. The problem is, of course, with the incentive itself, which is what we're going to be challenging on the show today. So hopefully you guys will be able to think about this a little bit more carefully by the time that we are done. So as I said before, in the state of Kentucky, the way that tenure works is that you have to work at a single school for 4 years before you become eligible for teacher tenure. And on the first day of your 5th year, you become a tenured teacher. So I'm in my 4th year this year at my school, and I really do enjoy working for my school. It is kind of like the closest that you're ever going to get at a government school to being in a private school. We have an open enrollment system in our county, and most parents that have middle school students want to open enroll their students in our school. It's great because we have a great administrator, and we have great administrators, and they hire great teachers. So, but this is my 4th year there, so I will be eligible to begin the process of tenure this year. So I want to talk about how it works in the state of Kentucky, and if you don't live in Kentucky, I guarantee you that if you look at your state's teacher tenure regulations, they're probably very similar to ours. And so I want to talk about how this works in our state. So the state does provide on their website, I got this through the Kentucky Department of Education, but they have an entire teacher tenure frequently asked questions sheet. Yeah, that I got through the Kentucky Department of Education, KDE, and I downloaded it here, and I highlighted some of the sections of the text that I think are the most important for our conversation today. So the first thing that I want to look at today are the requirements for teacher tenure. And again, these are the requirements that are outlined by the state of Kentucky. And so tenure requirements, it says here, and this is from KDE. I'll post a link to it if you want to read it for yourself in the show notes. It says, who is eligible for continuing status, aka tenure, in Kentucky? Teachers defined as any person for whom certification is required as a basis of employment, with the exception of the superintendent and vocational education teachers meeting the certification standards established by the EPSB and employed by a public school district. This means that a properly certified individual working in a position that requires certification in a public school district will be eligible for tenure, including classroom teachers and principals. This does not include superintendents, classified employees, or certified employees working in a position that does not require certification. What are the basic requirements to obtain or regain tenure in Kentucky? According to KRS 161.740, it's great bureaucratic numbering there, a teacher shall attain continuing service status either for the first time or will regain it so long as the certified individual has worked 4 years out of the last 6 in the same district, is renewed for a 5th year while currently employed, and assumes his or her duties during that 5th year. So these are the requirements for tenure eligibility, which I, for the first time in my career, fit. And so there's a lot of explanations here, and you can read through a lot of it, but I'm going to scroll down towards the bottom. Where it talks about loss of tenure, right? So under what circumstances can tenure be lost? And this is the really bad one, because the argument that I'm going to make, and from a libertarian perspective, the argument that I think is the most important today, is that tenure does protect public employees from being fired, even if they underperform. So one of the incentives that tenure creates is the incentive to underperform, because once you get tenure, there's no incentive for you to work hard to keep your job, because it's extremely difficult for your school district to fire you. And so there's a section here towards the end of this frequently asked questions post that the state put out called loss of tenure. And I want to read a piece of this for you guys here. It says, under what circumstances can tenure be lost? Tenure may be lost through A, retirement, B, resignation, or C, termination for cause. And so it talks about some of the reasons why someone might lose their tenure. And the first they're going to address is, does a reduction in force result in a loss of tenure for teachers affected by the reduction? And a reduction in force essentially means that a school district has to scale back. They have to let teachers go because either of budgeting shortfalls or because of redistricting or something like that. And so does a reduction in force result in a loss of tenure? It says under KRS 161.800, superintendents are provided the authority to reduce the number of teachers in the district for reasons of decreased pupil enrollment or the suspension of schools or territorial changes affecting the district. The statute statute requires that in making determination on retaining teachers, the superintendent give preference to teachers on continuing contracts and to teachers with greater seniority. That's the problem right there. So I'm going to read it one more time. The statute requires that in making determinations on retaining teachers, the superintendent gives preferences to teachers on continuing contracts and to teachers with greater seniority. One of the problems that we have recognized, though, in the libertarian movement about tenure, whether it's public sector tenure or private sector tenure, and this is one of the reasons why higher education institutions are going away from this model, is that it does give preference to teachers with seniority. But again, just because you've been teaching for a long time does not mean that you're a good teacher. Like, there are plenty of second and third year teachers that are just as good as teachers that have been teaching for 20 or 22 or 23 years. And if we as teachers are supposed to be public employees, and really beyond that, we're supposed to be public servants, then we shouldn't give preference to teachers just because they have greater seniority. Like, that doesn't make any sense at all, especially if we're trying to give the most benefit to the taxpayer who are paying to the taxpayers who are paying our salary. In reality, school districts should be able to keep the teachers that they think are the most effective in the classroom. And I understand that that is subjective, and I understand that in a bureaucratic political system that sometimes teachers that are able to build relationships with the bureaucrats at central office would keep their jobs when more qualified teachers would lose them. But overall, this is exactly what teacher tenure does. It gives preferences to teachers who have greater seniority instead of the teachers that are actually performing in the classroom. So it goes on and kind of talks about losing status if school districts are annexed or things like that. And then it says, like, if you lose your certification, like if you do something real bad and they pull your teacher certification away from you, then they'll take away tenure. All right, so all that stuff is there. But the main point of this FAQ that I wanted to read to you guys today is, as I said before, it gives preferential treatment to teachers that have been doing it for a long time instead of teachers that are successful in the classroom. And this is a really, really, really big problem. And one of the things that I think that we have to understand is that, again, if I was a private sector employee, like if I went to a company and I was working for the private sector and I didn't perform, it doesn't matter how long I've been there. It doesn't matter if I've been there for 1 year, if I've been there for 18 years. If I'm not doing the job that my boss in the private sector was asking me to do, they would let me go. Like, they would fire me because I wasn't getting the job done. And so we know from the private sector that this doesn't work, and it's a bad deal, right? No business is going to keep an underperforming employee, especially if it results in a loss of profits from that business. But it doesn't work that way with public sector employees. Like, you can get tenure and theoretically underperform, as Thomas Sowell makes that point in the introduction. It happens all around the country. You can theoretically underperform, and you still get to keep your job because it's incredibly expensive and incredibly difficult for a school district to fire a teacher who has tenure. And we have to ask ourselves whether or not, again, if teachers are supposed to be quote unquote public servants, this is the best deal for the public that pays our salary. I don't think that it is, because I think that teachers should be removed from their position if they do not perform and replaced with teachers that are more successful in the classroom. Like, that just inherently makes sense. And I think that most people, even if you believe in the public school system, like even if you're a progressive and you think that public schooling should be the only school option for the students in our country, it should make sense to you that you would want the best, hardest working teachers in the classroom, not teachers that get tenure and can just rest on that for the rest of their career. And again, if you think about the incentive structure that provides, what incentive is there to innovate and to try to do better and to push boundaries within the classroom if it doesn't matter one way or the other? Like, if your continuing employment is not based on innovation and hard work, but rather based on tenure that's conferred after only 4 years of working for the public school system, what motivation is there to continue to try to get better at your job? And again, I know that a lot of teachers would hear this and say, well, we're afraid of losing our job. And I understand that, like, that makes sense. But if you were working in the private sector, you would not have that. You wouldn't have tenure to back you up there. Like, you wouldn't have tenure to rest on if you underperformed. And again, I'm lucky enough that I get to work with a lot of very good professional teachers that are excellent at their job and that haven't rested on their tenure, that they are tenured, yes, but they continue to work hard year in and year out to provide for the academic needs of the student. But on the other hand, I have met teachers before that get tenure and then they just stop innovating, and it's impossible to get rid of those people. This is also one of the reasons why I don't like the teachers unions. And again, I'm not a part of the union. Fortunately, Kentucky is a right to work state, but I think the unions provide a lot of the same distortions of incentive structures that teacher tenure does. And again, most of my coworkers are a part of the union. And again, the idea behind these teachers unions from my coworkers' perspective is that these teachers unions will protect these teachers in the event that they get sued by capricious parents. So I understand why a lot of people do that. And I got to say that, like, I'm not a union guy, but the union reps at my school, they really understand. They really understand and want to protect good teachers from losing their jobs for things that are outside of their control. And so I understand that. But again, like with these unions, they create all kinds of problems. Again, collective bargaining is one of these things where we get a cost of living raise every year at work, regardless of our performance the year before. And so we have a system where you work more and more and more, like you accumulate more and more years of experience, and you get paid instead of having to like work to try to earn a raise. You're just automatically going to get one, right? And so this is one of the problems of incentives that creates is, again, if you have a system where you're protected from your job and you're constantly getting these collectively bargained raises every year, like there's no incentive to work harder and to do better and to innovate unless you are self-motivated to do so. And again, I work with a lot of people that are self-motivated to do so. I think that's and I have a lot of respect for people that operate in these incentive structures and continue to innovate and do better year in and year out. I think it's really great, but it also creates incentives for other underperforming teachers, and it makes it harder for us to get rid of them. And again, I don't think as a libertarian that these incentives make any sense. And as someone who believes that like money actually matters and that if the government is going to tax me, I want that tax money to be used most effectively, tenure is just unacceptable, and it doesn't work because, again, it protects teachers. And the teachers unions are the same way. Like, and this is the thing about public sector unions, which are so problematic, is that a public sector, but besides the fact that we all know that public sector unions, they take money from their members and they contribute them to Democratic politicians, right? That's just a fact, right? Unions are inherently progressive, right? Because they have progressive views. I would even say some implicitly Marxist views on labor relations. And so when they collect money from their dues-paying members, they use those to promote particular politicians. And it's like 98%. I think there was a survey done by Pew or Gallup or one of those places a few years ago, and like 98% of public sector union dues that are contributed to political campaigns go to Democrats. And we need to be honest about that. Like that's what they're doing with your money. They're running it in favor of candidates that are going to vote on issues that I completely disagree with. And I don't think a dime of taxpayer money should go to any political contribution or any political campaign at all. I just don't think that's the case. And then there's kind of the broader picture that the unions exist to serve the teachers, right? Which I understand. Like, I understand why people think that would be a good idea, but these teachers unions don't care about the public. They don't care about the kids. They're only there for their dues-paying members. They're only there to protect the teachers. And while they do sometimes offer protection for really good teachers that need to be protected, oftentimes they're just trying to promote the interest of the unions and the interest of certain teachers at the expense of the public. And that's a really, really big problem. So there was a really good article that was written a few years ago, actually in 2017, called The End of Teacher Tenure. And you can find it over at the Hoover Institution. They're kind of like a conservative think tank, but they have done a lot of good. I mean, Thomas Sowell was a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he's phenomenal. And there are some other good thinkers over there. So this one, I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes today, but the article is called The End of Teacher Tenure. It was written in 2017, so before COVID and all of that stuff happened. And the author is a man named Chester E. Finn. And so he has this really good article where he talks about teacher tenure and all of the problems that arise from that, and why the subtitle is Ending the Practice in K-12 Schools would be good for both students and taxpayers. And so he spends the first couple of paragraphs talking about how teacher tenure used to be kind of like the standard in higher education, and so universities and colleges and things like that. And that since the 1970s, universities have slowly been moving away from teacher tenure because it's not worked for them, and they have all kinds of other problems, and they want to be able to control the people that they hire and things like that. So teacher tenure is much less common in higher education than it was before. And then I'm going to read a couple of sections of this article here as we think through this today, because I think it's really important, and he makes some really important he makes some really important points that we should consider. So he says this. So he, after explaining about how higher education is moving away from the tenure model, he then talks about public education. In the K-12 world, however, and this is what Finn says, tenure remains the norm for public school teachers in the district sector, vouchsafed in most places by state law and politics, as well as local contracts, even in so-called right-to-work states, and that would be a state like Kentucky. It may be achieved after as few as 3 years of classroom experience and be based on nothing more than a few satisfactory evaluations bestowed by a novice teacher supervisor during that period. Unfortunately, we have ample evidence that such evaluations are nearly always at least satisfactory, if not outstanding. Although many states and districts made worthy changes to their teacher evaluation practices, the pushback against those changes was intense, the methodology usually had flaws, and many districts have softened or abandoned this pursuit, which means, of course, that the principals of district-operated public schools continue to have little ability to select, deploy, promote, retain, and compensate the instructors they think do the best jobs for their students, much less to dismiss unsatisfactory teachers. Although a handful of school systems have installed elaborate peer review schemes to address the problem of tenured teachers who lose or never really had their mojo, these are cumbersome, costly, and confer little real management authority on school leaders. It's useful to distinguish two issues. The first is the complicated and politically fraught business of evaluating teachers, both new and veteran, how to do it, who should do it, what should the evaluation be based on, what should its consequences be, what politics surround it, etc. And the second issue is the question of tenure itself. Should teachers, often by the age of 25, obtain guaranteed lifetime employment in a school system on the basis of a few years of satisfactory evaluations? For that matter, should anyone get lifetime tenure in any job? The question may legitimately be asked of civil servants, policemen, soldiers, and judges, as well as school and university faculty. Teacher and professor tenures, and these are the two issues that he's going to address in the rest of the article, and he goes on. Teacher tenure rests on three pillars: simple job security and longevity, really a form of guaranteed continuing employment, often viewed as a fringe benefit that substitutes for more pay, and that's definitely true. Protection against diverse forms of discrimination, favoritism, and capriciousness on the part of the employers, and academic freedom, meaning, in essence, that the instructors can almost never be fired on account of what they say or write. The first of these is really just a matter of terms of employment. I think this one's a really important one, and if you're a teacher listening to this, I really want you to think about the first point that he makes here. So he says the first of these is really just a matter of terms of employment. How valuable is job security to the employee and to the employer? Would you rather earn $50,000 a year in a job that you know will continue indefinitely and does not depend on performance, or $75,000 in a job that is assured only for a several-year term and where renewal of the position hinges on how well you do at it? As we observe school teachers in major cities finding it hard to afford housing on their current salaries, we might reasonably suppose that many, given the option, would choose higher pay. And the districts that employ them would surely welcome back the budgetary flexibility and reduced long-term obligations that follow. And I do think that that makes a lot of sense. And he provides some evidence in here, and you can read the article for yourself and see how he explains this. But there is a correlation between teacher tenure and lower rates of pay. And I think especially for like my coworkers who are good at their jobs and who show up every day and try really hard, and then from my perspective too, I would rather not have the guarantee of tenure and make more money year in and year out. I think that'd be a better deal. And again, it would incentivize teachers that might, under the right incentive structures, perform well in the classroom to do a good job, right? If you're going to say, no, you don't have your job, your job is not guaranteed year in and year out, but if you do well, we're going to pay you more money. I think a lot of people, especially given how expensive things have become, would take that. All right. And then here's the second one. The second rationale for tenure: a safe harbor from discrimination and favoritism, deserves to be taken seriously, but the codification in constitutions and statutes of enumerable due process and anti-discrimination protections radically shrinks the rationale for inserting additional tenure provisions into employment contracts for this reason. And so he talks about the First Amendment, and he talks about the problems of teachers indoctrinating their students and being shielded being shielded from kind of liability for what teachers do or say to the kids in the classroom. And I think that that is really important as well. Like, again, from an administrative perspective, if you have a teacher who pays into the union, who will give them legal protection if they really screw up, and if they have tenure, it's really, really difficult to get rid of some of those teachers there. And basically getting rid of teacher tenure. Getting rid of teacher tenure would make it easier for administrators to remove teachers that don't do well at their job. He goes on to say, it's no secret that the HR practices of private and charter schools, neither of which typically practices tenure, work far better than those of district schools from the standpoint of both principals and students. A forthcoming Fordham Institute study also shows that far fewer of their teachers are chronically absent. That's because the school's leaders can generally hire and deploy the instructors that they deem best suited to their pupils, and they're not obligated to retain any teachers who don't do a satisfactory job. They can be nimble in regrouping, restaffing, and redirecting their schools, and everyone who is employed there knows that that's the way it works. Nobody has a right to continued employment untethered to performance and the school's needs. The employer has the authority to alter the shape, nature, and size of the organization, to redeploy human resources, to substitute capital for labor, to replace elbow grease with technology, and to hire and fire according to shifting pupil needs and organizational priorities. These HR changes are often framed in terms of making it easier to fire bad teachers, yet that's not the main point of radical tenure reform. The number of truly bad apples in the instructional barrel is small. While it's important that school leaders have the power to shed such people and not just shift them to other schools, a process known in the field as the dance of the lemons, and I think Thomas Sowell came up with that term maybe, the larger point is that they need to be able to run the kinds of schools that kids deserve to attend at a cost that taxpayers can afford to pay. In addition, a decidedly non-trivial fringe benefit for society would be to bring the profession of school teaching into the 21st century. So a great article there that deals with a lot of the issues that we've already covered on this show today. All right, so I'm going to make a couple more points here before we wrap up for the day that I think are really important. So for me, it is my 4th year. I'm going to go through my review process, and I will be offered tenure. And my goal is to turn down tenure. So I'm not going to be requesting tenure. And at this point, I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to say no to tenure. I'm not really sure what it's like, because I've never heard of anyone turning down tenure when it was offered to them. But I just can't as a public sector employee who has libertarian principles, I just can't personally accept tenure. I don't think it's a good thing. And even though I'm going to work hard and be self-motivated and go in and do the best that I can as long as I am in public education, I have no desire to perpetuate a system that I feel like is ineffective and inefficient and really bad for the taxpayers that are funding the school. And again, I know for like the anarcho-capitalist type people that are listening to this, your position is going to be that we should abolish all public education. And look, I'm here to tell you that I do think that a completely private education system would be a lot more efficient and a lot more effective than the one that we currently have. So I agree with you in principle, but the public education establishment is not going to go away anytime soon. And I think that we can work hard on making meaningful reforms to the public education system that at least makes it more efficient and more effective at meeting the needs of the students and meeting the needs of the taxpayers as well. And I really do think that my decision to turn down tenure is a decision that I am going to stand on principle. And I think that in a lot of ways, principles ought to matter more than personal gain. Yes, as a libertarian, could I go to school and accept tenure and have protection? I could absolutely do that. But one of the things that, being a Christian in particular has taught me is that sometimes you have to stand up for what you think is right, even if it costs you something. And so, yeah, I have a great administration right now. I have no fear that they're going to let me go or that they would fire me because I have a good relationship with them and they know that I work hard in my class. And that might change someday, right? And I might be in a position where I get one of those, district appointed principals who is capricious and who only likes people that have a certain way of looking at public education, and they might let me go. I understand that is a risk that I am taking by turning down tenure, but I would rather stand up on principle and say, I don't think that this system works, and I think it's a bad deal, not just for teachers that perform well, but also for the taxpayers, than accept it and not stand up for my principles. And again, I think that this is the best choice for me to make. All right, so as we begin to wrap up for the day, let's think about how if you're not a part of the education system and you're not a teacher, and so you don't have the ability to turn down tenure or say no to the unions or stand up for your libertarian principles, but your kids go to school, how can you go about making a difference in your school to make your kids' school and your kids' learning environment a better place, right? Now, again, as I said before, like I'm completely in favor of privatizing the school systems. I think that would be better for absolutely everybody involved. Like I think that should be the goal from a libertarian perspective of public education. But we have a large government-run monopoly right now, and unfortunately, because there's a government-run monopoly on education in the United States, it makes it very difficult for parents like me to homeschool their kids. I mean, it's just impractical for a lot of parents, and a lot of the private alternatives are too expensive because, again, they're competing with a government-run monopoly, and so that's one of the reasons for the high cost of private education. So if you want to make a meaningful difference in your school and you're not a teacher, how would you go about doing that? So I think the first thing that you can do is to reach out and build meaningful relationships with your child's teacher. Like, again, you have to remember that we're at the very, very bottom of an extremely large bureaucracy that goes all the way up to the federal government. And a lot of what your students' teachers do and say in the classroom is in response to the systems that have been created by these bureaucrats, right? And by reaching out to your child's teacher, especially if you have a concern about your students' learning or what they're learning in the classroom, that's one of the best things that you can do to kind of build that relationship and make sure that your kid's getting the education that they need. I mean, the vast majority of teachers that I know, at least at my school, really do want kids to be successful, and they really do want kids to learn. They went to education for the same reasons that I did, because they believe in the value of an education and because they wanted to work with kids. And so most teachers are going to be willing to work with you. And again, one of the things you have to remember as a parent too is that, like, I have 150 students, all right? So your kid, like, is not more special to me than somebody else's kid, right? So as a parent, if you have a problem, like, don't think that your child deserves preferential treatment. Don't think that your kid's teacher is necessarily against them or fighting against them. Reach out to them, ask questions, build relationships with them. And again, I think most of the problems that occur between teachers and the public are the result of miscommunications. And having that relationship with your students' teachers is going to be very, very helpful, and it's going to allow you to kind of know what's going on in the classroom. The other big thing that I want to point out too, before we wrap up today, is that we have to remember, like, especially if you're a libertarian, actually, the libertarian thing, we'll put that to a side. Like, if you're a Christian, you should understand that it is not the school's job to discipline or raise or educate your kids. It is your responsibility as a parent, right? Like, it is, like, as a teacher, I want to be there to support your kid and help them learn and help them grow, but it is not my job to raise them. It is your job as a parent. And if your kid goes to school and gets in all kinds of trouble and has all kinds of problems, you need to do a little bit of self-reflection and think, am I doing everything that I can as a parent to support my kid? Because a lot of parents do. Another problem with a public education system, a lot of parents outsource the raising of their kids to these schools, and that's always going to wind up being a disaster. It is not the function of the school systems to raise children or discipline kids or to train them in life or anything like that. It's our job to teach them, right? That's the goal, right? And I think both Christians and libertarians intuitively understand this. It's the reason why even before COVID, a lot of Christians pulled their kids out of public schools, because they wanted to raise them and have them educated in an environment that reinforced values that they were already being taught at home. And now that a lot of libertarians have begun to pull their kids out of the public schools, I think that is the motivation for them as well. So again, if you're a parent and you feel like you're helpless, reach out to your teachers, or reach out to your students' teachers, contact them, talk to them, work with them, and I'm going to be willing to bet more often than not that the teacher wants to find ways to support you. Okay, so again, I think that this is a really important thing to take into consideration if you are a parent. All right, well, it's obviously a very large and controversial issue, so I'm really excited I got to talk about this on my show today. If you're listening to this and you want to email this to my school district, go right ahead. I'm looking forward to having this conversation with my administrators. They already think I'm crazy anyways, and so I know that this is going to be a really productive, and they're very supportive of me too. They're great people. I know that I'm going to be able to have this conversation in full confidence with them, and everything's going to be just fine. So I tell you, here in a couple weeks, if I'll give you guys a full update and tell you how everything goes as I begin to turn down tenure. Obviously, I couldn't discuss every single aspect of this issue that I wanted to on today's show, so we'll come back and have some more education issues. There's a lot to talk about here, and obviously I have a lot of opinions on it. I'd love to do a whole episode on unions and all of those kinds of things. So over the next year or so, as you listen to this show, expect a couple more issues, a couple more episodes on education, because it's going to happen, and I think that these are important conversations to have. Again, if you have any questions for me, if you think I missed anything, or if you have an alternative perspective that you would like me to address on a future show, reach out to me. Again, I really appreciate you guys listening to the end of the podcast. Thank you all so much, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a good one. The Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.